The sky hung heavy over Oak Ridge that evening, low and gray, as if the whole town was holding its breath. It was the kind of afternoon that settled into your bones, quiet and watchful. The kind where nothing good ever seems to happen. Mason Thompson pulled his aging pickup to the edge of the town's garbage dump. To most, this place was just a forgotten corner of a forgotten town, where the broken and discarded were left to rot. But today, something moved. It wasn't the usual rustle of rats or the distant buzz of flies over trash. No, this was something else, something that didn't belong. A shadow twitching between a rusted washing machine and a mound of garbage. Bags split open like wounds. Mason squinted, instinct kicking in before thought. 2 decades in the military had hardwired him to notice the unnatural, the wrong. Whatever it was too large for a rat, too fragile for a stray coyote. He turned off the engine. The rumble died into silence. He stepped out quietly, boots pressing against gravel like whispers. His breath clouded in the cool air, heart beating with a rhythm he hadn't felt since Afghanistan. Then he saw it, a German shepherd, or what was, left of one. The dog was so thin its ribs jutted out like a second skeleton, the shape of its body grotesquely familiar, like the wings of a bat, stretched and sharp. The fur was patchy, skin marked by what looked sickeningly like burns. And its eyes. Those eyes didn't belong to an animal. Not really. They belonged to something broken. Something betrayed. Amber eyes locked with his. No barking, no growling. Just waiting, like the dog was already somewhere else in its mind. Somewhere dark. Mason took a cautious step forward. The dog flinched and retreated, trembling but not feral, not wild, just alone. And Mason recognized it, not just as a soldier but as a man, because he'd seen that look before, in the mirror. In the reflection that stared back at him during the long, empty nights when the war came roaring back in his dreams. That 1,000-yard stare, the look of something that had survived the worst kind of hell, and didn't quite believe it was. "Out yet. I'm not going to hurt you," Mason whispered. The words were more for himself than the dog. The shepherd's ears twitched, not in fear, in recognition. Maybe the last flicker of hope in a creature left to die among the trash. No one else had come for him, but Mason had. And in that single moment, something shifted, quietly, without fanfare. The beginning of a story neither of them could have predicted. A man with too much past, a dog with too many scars, and between them, the faintest possibility of redemption. Part 1. A town in decline, a man in pieces. Oak Ridge wasn't always like this. There was a time when its factories hummed with purpose, when the smokestacks that now stood as hollow reminders once painted the sky with prosperity. Back then, children rode their bikes down Main Street waving to shopkeepers who knew their names. Back then, the American dream still lived here. Tired maybe, but alive. That Oak Ridge is long gone. Now the windows are boarded up. The corner pharmacy is a vape shop, and the old movie theater's marquee has read "closed for renovations" for a decade. No one's renovating anything, and no one's coming back. Mason Thompson knew that better than anyone. He didn't return to Oak Ridge by choice. He came back because he had nowhere else to go. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with a bum knee, half the hearing in his left ear, and a patchwork of invisible wounds no amount of rehab could stitch together. His discharge wasn't ceremonial. It was medical. His homecoming wasn't warm. It was quiet. The divorce papers were waiting for him. Sarah hadn't stopped loving him, not really. But love wasn't enough to protect Lily from the man Mason had become. "I can't keep explaining to her why her daddy screams in his sleep," Sarah had said softly, tears unshed. "Why she has to tiptoe when you're home." Mason couldn't argue. So he didn't. Now he lived in a rented house on the edge of town, a lonely single-story place flanked by forest on one side and nothing on the other. The kind of house where silence was loud and memories had too much room to echo. He worked maintenance at the local VA hospital. Fixing leaky faucets, unclogging toilets, replacing light bulbs. It was quiet work, solitary, and he preferred it that way. Machines didn't ask questions. Pipes didn't flinch when he walked into a room. And sometimes, just sometimes, he could believe he was useful again. On weekends, he saw Lily, 10 years old and already wiser than he'd ever been. She had his stubborn jaw and Sarah's soft eyes. Their time together was both his greatest joy and sharpest wound. Every laugh she gave him felt like a borrowed miracle. Every goodbye left him hollow. She didn't know the whole story. She didn't know about the firefight outside Lashkar Gah, or the IED that turned his best friend into a name on a plaque. She didn't know about the therapist who used words like complex PTSD and emotional dysregulation. All she knew was that Daddy flinched at fireworks and sometimes forgot how to smile, but she still hugged him with both arms. Every time. Mason lived for those weekends, and dreaded them too. Oak Ridge was filled with ghosts, not the kind that rattled chains, but the quieter ones, empty storefronts, lost futures. People who looked away when you passed because they didn't want to see how much you reminded them of their own disappointment. And yet, even here, there were people who tried. Dr. Eleanor Carter, Ellie to most, was one of them. She ran the town's only veterinary clinic out of a modest building near the high school. Her silver hair made her look older than she was, and her no-nonsense demeanor had scared off more than a few pet owners. But if your dog was dying, and everyone else said there was no hope, Ellie Carter was your last stop. She didn't flinch at blood. She didn't ask stupid questions, and she had hands that could coax life back into the frailest of creatures. Ellie knew pain. She didn't talk about it often, but Mason had heard whispers. Her brother, a Marine, lost to an IED in Fallujah. Some wounds never close. Some turn you into the kind of person who saves others because you couldn't save the one who mattered. They didn't talk much. But Ellie and Mason had an understanding, a silent recognition of damaged souls. There was also Sheriff James Wilkins, Oak Ridge's law for nearly 20 years, built like a fridge, with a voice that could strip paint. People obeyed him not because they liked him, but because they were afraid of what might happen if they didn't. Mason had never liked the man, even before the war. Wilkins had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Still, in a place like Oak Ridge, you didn't make waves unless you were prepared to drown. It was into this faded, forgotten town that the German shepherd, skinny as bone and wrapped in scars, had appeared, dumped like so much trash, left to rot, and Mason, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, couldn't look away. The next morning, he came back. Not with traps or chains or leashes, with meatloaf, a Tupperware container, a shallow bowl of water, a quiet hope. The dog wasn't there at first, but Mason saw the paw prints, small, tentative indentations in the mud. One step forward, then a hesitant pause, like the dog didn't quite believe it was allowed to eat anymore. Mason set the food on a plastic crate, backed away, climbed into his truck. "I can wait," he muttered, settling in. He waited for hours. Patience he had. The military had taught him how to sit still until your knees screamed and your mind wandered into places it shouldn't. He watched birds pick at the meat, then scatter. And finally, movement. The dog emerged like a ghost, belly scraping the ground, ears pinned, terrified and desperate all at once. He devoured the food in 3 gulps, lapped at the water like he didn't believe it was real. Mason watched, said, "Nothing." That was the beginning. Day 1 of something neither of them had words for yet. A man with nothing left to lose, and a dog who'd already lost everything. They called him Shadow, not because he moved like one, though he did, silent and low, slipping through debris like a whisper. No. Mason gave him that name because he seemed less like a dog and more like a memory. Something haunting the edge of awareness. Something that didn't quite belong to this world anymore. On day 2, Shadow didn't show. The meatloaf was untouched, water bowl still half full when Mason returned at dusk. He tried not to feel the sting of disappointment, but it was there, tight in his chest. heavier than it should have been. It wasn't just the dog. It was the possibility of connection, of redemption. But on day 3, the paw prints returned, closer this time, deeper in the mud. And Mason saw them for what they were, not just a trail, but a decision. Shadow was thinking about trusting him. So Mason changed his routine. He set the food down as always, but instead of retreating to the truck, he sat cross-legged on the ground, 30 feet away, still, quiet. He didn't look directly at the dog, just waited. Let Shadow decide. The shepherd appeared like a phantom. Watching, weighing, hunger made the decision. He crept forward, body trembling, every step a battle between instinct and need. He didn't bolt, he didn't growl. He ate, and Mason spoke, softly. "Steady. I'm thinking of calling you Shadow. It fits, don't you think?" The dog's ears twitched at the sound, a flicker, a pause. He didn't run. That was progress. On the 5th day, the sky broke open. Rain pounded Oak Ridge like penance, turning the garbage dump into a swamp of filth and floating memories. Mason still came. Jacket soaked, boots squelching in the mud, heart thudding with something dangerously close to panic. He called, he whistled. "Come on, boy, where are you?" No answer. An hour passed. Cold seeped into his bones. The rain showed no mercy. Then a sound, faint, weak, a whimper. Mason followed it through a maze of soggy trash and collapsed metal. And there, pinned beneath a crumpled sheet of corrugated aluminum, was Shadow. One leg twisted. Water rising. Eyes, wide with the kind of fear that doesn't come from pain, but memory. "I've got you," Mason said, dropping to his knees. Shadow bared his teeth. A growl, low and warning. "I know," Mason whispered, inching closer. "But I have to touch. You now, there's no other way." Slowly he lifted the metal. Shadow whimpered but didn't bite, he didn't fight. Not because he trusted Mason yet, but because he had no other choice. That moment changed everything. Wrapped in Mason's jacket, Shadow lay limp in the truck's passenger seat, barely breathing. Every so often, Mason reached over to check if he was still alive. Each time the dog's ribs rose, fell, alive barely. At home, Mason carried him inside like fragile cargo, laid him on a blanket, called Ellie. "I need a favor," he said. "No questions." "Those are usually the worst." "Kind," she replied. But 40 minutes later, her truck pulled into the driveway. When she saw the dog, she stopped cold. "Jesus, Mason, this dog should be dead." "But he's not," Mason said, "and he's going to stay that way." Ellie didn't argue. She got to work, cleaning wounds, splinting the leg, administering fluids. Her hands were swift, practiced. But her eyes kept flicking to Mason, puzzled. "He's been abused," she said eventually. "Not just neglected. Look at these scars. Someone did this to him." Mason clenched his jaw. "Can he recover?" "Physically? Maybe. Mentally?" She shrugged. "That's on you." He nodded. She hesitated. "You'll need to care for him constantly. Are you up for that?" Mason didn't answer right away. His therapist still used terms like emotional detachment and avoidant behavior. Mason couldn't keep houseplants alive. But this dog, this broken creature, he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. That night, Mason slept on the couch. Shadow didn't move. But sometime in the dark, the dog dragged himself across the floor, inch by inch, until his side pressed lightly against Mason's hand. Not trust. Not yet, but a beginning. The days that followed were regimented. A schedule more demanding than basic training. Medications every 6 hours. Wounds cleaned thrice daily. Small meals offered gently, with soft murmurs of encouragement. "Good boy," Mason would whisper. "You're doing good." The words tasted strange, rusted from disuse. Shadow watched him with eyes that held a single question. "When will you hurt me?" Mason never did. And slowly, Shadow began to believe that. On the 9th day, while bathing the dog, Mason found something unusual beneath the fur, A small hard lump near the base of Shadow's neck. His stomach turned to ice. He called Ellie. She came, examined. "It's not organic," she said. "Not a tumor. Feels like a chip. A microchip? Smaller. Placed differently. This isn't your average pet tracker. It reminds me of research tags or military ID implants." The implications landed like thunder. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He watched Shadow twitch in his sleep, caught in some invisible nightmare. Soft, panicked sounds escaped his throat. Mason sat beside him, spoke gently about Afghanistan, about dust storms, about friends lost, about the silence that follows trauma. And for the first time, Shadow woke without fear. They were the same, Mason realized. Two soldiers, two ghosts, two lives stitched together by war. They said war leaves marks, but no one ever talked about how it follows you home. For Mason, that truth now had a name. Shadow. What started as a rescue was becoming something deeper, something stranger. Because Shadow wasn't just any stray. His behavior, how he responded to certain hand signals, how he placed himself between Mason and the door, always facing outward, wasn't learned from instinct. It was training, military training. Ellie saw it too. "Have you tested any commands?" she asked during a checkup. Her fingers gently probed Shadow's healing ribs. "Formal ones?" Mason hesitated. "I thought I was imagining it." "Try," she urged. "See what he knows." So Mason tried. He snapped his fingers and pointed. "Left." Shadow moved, cautious but precise. He clapped once. Shadow dropped low, eyes scanning the perimeter. One night, Mason dropped a ceramic plate. It shattered on the floor. Instead of fleeing, Shadow sprang between Mason and the doorway. Not out of fear, but protection. Something clicked. That night, Mason pulled out his old laptop. He stayed up until dawn. Photos, articles, training manuals, military working dogs, MWDs, Belgian Malinois, German Shepherds, labs, elite animals, trained. For detection, search and rescue, protection, even covert reconnaissance. Shadow didn't just resemble one. He was one, and if that chip in his neck was what Ellie suspected, it meant his past was classified and potentially dangerous. The next day, Mason called in a favor. Dave Lockhart had been with Mason in Afghanistan. Now he worked stateside, liaising with K-9 units at Fort Benning. "You've got a dog with military training?" Dave asked, half joking. "Not just training," Mason replied. "Implants, reactions to Pashto phrases, and a chip in his neck that isn't standard." There was a pause. "Send me a photo." Mason did. 2 days later, the call came. "I showed it to someone in Intel," Dave said. "That dog's not just any MWD. He was part of Operation Sentinel." Mason blinked. "Never heard of it." "You wouldn't have," Dave said quietly. "It was Black Ops, ultra-classified, a small unit of canines trained not just for drugs or explosives, but to map entire trafficking networks. They weren't sniffing out danger. They were tracing it, from source to supplier." Mason's pulse quickened. "So what does that make? Shadow?" "His designation was Delta 7, Dave said. He was one of the best." Mason sat in stunned silence. Delta 7, he remembered. Barely. A base in Helmand Province. A whisper of a dog. Not loud, not aggressive, just focused. Moving beside a handler like a ghost, almost invisible. "He was reported KIA. Dave continued. "IED blast, 2 years ago." "He's very much alive," Mason said, glancing at Shadow curled on the rug. "Which means someone lied," Dave replied. "Either the records are wrong or someone wanted Delta 7 listed as dead." The implications were staggering. Mason stared at Shadow, who lifted his head at the sound of his voice. "You remember that name?" Mason asked softly. "Delta 7? Shadow didn't bark, didn't whine, but his ears perked, his posture changed. Recognition. Not confusion, recognition. Mason tried another test. Kadidmat, he said Pashto, service. Shadow immediately straightened, eyes locked, body alert. Jesus, he wasn't just trained, he remembered. That same day, Mason got a call from Sarah. Someone's, been asking about you, she said. At the hospital. Claimed to be animal control. We don't have animal control in Oak Ridge, Mason replied, heart racing. Exactly, Sarah said. He asked where you lived. I told security. But something's off, Mason. Later that night, Frank Miller, Mason's elderly neighbor, showed up with a casserole. And a warning. There's a sedan been parked down the road last few nights, Frank said. Thought you should see this. He handed Mason a camera. Grainy photos, the sedan, and Sheriff Wilkins, speaking to two unknown men beside it. Could be nothing, Frank added, but my gut says otherwise. Mason didn't sleep that night. Shadow lay at his feet, but Mason's eyes stayed open. The chip, the training, the reactions to commands, and now, Wilkins, a town sheriff interested in a dog the military thought was dead. What was going on? The next morning brought more than coffee. A local newspaper headline greeted him. Dangerous dog concerns rise in Oak Ridge. Below it, a photo of Mason walking Shadow in the park, taken without his knowledge. The article claimed a military-trained dog was roaming the town, quoted anonymous sources, called for public safety reform. Ellie was furious. This is targeted, she said. They're trying to turn the town against him. There's a council meeting tonight, she added. You need to speak. Mason didn't want to. He hated crowds, hated being the center of anything, but he owed Shadow. So he went. The meeting was tense. Sheriff Wilkins spoke first, called for muzzles, restrictions, special permits, all under the guise of safety. Then Mason stood. He spoke not as a soldier, not as a patient, but as a man who had found something worth fighting for again. I found a German shepherd dying at the dump, he said. Starved, burned, terrified. I didn't ask where he came from, I just knew he needed help. He spoke of Shadow's recovery, his bond with Lily, his gentle heart. This isn't an attack dog, he said. This is a survivor. And something shifted in the room. Frank stood and added, that dog has more honor than half the people I've met. And Mason here, he saved him. We should be thanking him. The council didn't vote. They delayed. A small win. But Mason knew something now. This wasn't about fear of a dog. This was about something deeper. Someone was afraid of what Shadow might reveal, and they were getting desperate. They weren't hiding anymore. The shadows Mason had felt pressing in around him for weeks had names now. Badges, guns, and secrets they never meant to get out. And at the center of it all stood a dog the world believed was dead. Shadow. Delta. 7. A ghost from a war Mason couldn't forget. Trained for missions so covert they didn't even leave a footprint. But someone had brought that ghost home. And now, they wanted him gone. For good. It started with the sedan, parked 2 houses down, lights off, motor cold. Same car Frank had photographed. It showed up again, 3 nights in a row, always around midnight. Never stayed long. Then came the knock. Not the polite kind. The kind that said, "We're not asking anymore." Mason didn't answer. He and Shadow watched from the back of the house, lights off, breath shallow. The silhouette of a man stood at the door for a full 5 minutes before turning and walking away. He left no note. Didn't need to. The message was clear. The next morning, Mason found fresh boot prints in his backyard. They weren't his. Later that day, Dave called. I got more on Operation Sentinel, he said. It wasn't just about drugs. Mason sat forward. Shadow lay at his feet, alert. There were connections, stateside ones. Dave continued. Funding channels, politicians, maybe even law enforcement. Like our friendly neighborhood sheriff? Mason asked. Maybe, Dave said. But, listen, this goes deeper than you think. Sentinel dogs weren't just trained to detect drugs. Their chips were designed to record chemical signatures, GPS data, even handler interactions. Mason blinked. You're telling me Shadow is carrying data? Yes, Dave confirmed. And if whoever dumped him in Oak Ridge knew that, then they didn't just abandon him. They tried to erase him. Mason looked down. Shadow's amber eyes met his. They failed, Mason whispered. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he wrote names, dates, conversations. He documented every encounter since the day he found Shadow. If something happened to him, someone would know, because it was no longer just about a dog. It was about what that dog had seen, and what he remembered. 2 days later, things escalated. Sarah called. Her voice was tight, controlled, terrified. There are men here, Mason. They say they need to talk to you about the dog. Mason's blood ran cold. Put them on the phone. He said. A new voice answered. Calm, cold. You have something that doesn't belong to you, Mr. Thompson. Bring the dog. Bring everything you found. You have 1 hour. And if I don't? Mason asked. We're very good at making people disappear quietly. The line went dead. He stared at the phone. His daughter was in that house, his ex-wife, the people he still loved, and he had a choice. Surrender Shadow, or risk everything. Shadow stood beside him, bleeding, healing, watching like he already knew. Mason turned to Frank and Ellie. I'm going, he said, but not to give them what they want. We'll back you up, Frank said immediately. Ellie nodded. You're not alone in this. They made a plan. Frank had old comms gear from Vietnam, walkie-talkies, thermal scopes, a revolver he hadn't fired in decades. Ellie prepped Shadow with antibiotics and a mild stimulant. Enough to dull the pain, not enough to cloud his instincts. Then Mason loaded the pistol he hadn't touched since the war. Ready, boy? He asked. Shadow nudged his leg. Ready. They arrived just after dark. Mason approached the house alone. No lights, no sign of Sarah or Lily. He stepped inside. The silence was suffocating. Then a voice. Drop the weapon! From the shadows, 3 men emerged. Tactical gear. One with a silenced sidearm already trained on Mason. Where's the dog? One asked. Mason didn't answer. I said, but... He didn't finish, because from the hallway a blur of fur and fury lunged. Shadow, all teeth and muscle and precision. He went for the man with the gun. The one closest to Mason. The shot went wide. Chaos erupted. Mason ducked, rolled, fired once. Frank burst in from the back, Ellie right behind him with a tranq gun. Within seconds, 2 of the men were down. The third bolted. Mason chased him into the street. The man tripped. Hit the pavement hard. Mason stood over him, panting. Why? He demanded. Why bring him here? He knew too much, the man spat. The chip, what he saw. He remembered everything. We thought we wiped it. We thought he died. Didn't, Mason growled. And now you will answer for it. Police arrived minutes later. Not Wilkins, real state officers. Called by Ellie an hour earlier, with recordings, documents, and Shadow's chip data already transferred to a secure server. The man was taken into custody, the others too. Wilkins, gone, vanished before they arrived. But the evidence was enough. DEA. Agents descended on Oak Ridge within days. The factory Mason had once passed without thought turned out to be a distribution hub for opioids, funneled from Afghanistan, repackaged in the U.S., sold on small-town streets. Shadow's chip confirmed. Routes, locations, people. He wasn't just a dog, he was the witness they never expected, and the hero they couldn't erase. The town of Oak Ridge changed that week, maybe not in the ways that made headlines. The factories were still silent, the storefronts still empty. But for the first time in a long time, people looked each other in the eye. They spoke shadows, name with something like pride, because one broken dog, and the soldier who refused to give up on him, had forced a reckoning. Mason didn't ask for thanks. He wasn't built for praise. But as he walked the streets again, Shadow at his side, He noticed the nods, the soft greetings, the slow shift in the way people saw him, not as damaged, but as someone who had survived and helped something else survive too. Shadow's wound healed slowly. The fur on his side grew back in tufts. He still limped on rainy days. He still startled at loud noises. But he no longer trembled when someone reached for him, no longer flinched at open doors. He had a home now. And Mason? He had a mission again. Not one assigned by a commanding officer. Not one marked by maps and code names. This one was quiet, simple to protect, to rebuild. To be the kind of man a little girl could call dad without hesitation. To be the kind of companion a dog like Shadow could trust with his life. In the eye. Aftermath of the arrests, more truths came to light. Sheriff Wilkins was never found. His connections to the trafficking ring stretched far beyond Oak Ridge. International inquiries were launched. Shadow's data chip, a technological marvel once meant for military eyes only, was now central evidence in a multi-agency investigation. And still, Mason didn't feel victorious. Because the fight wasn't over. It never truly is, for people like him, for animals like Shadow. But they had each other. That was enough. In the evenings, Mason would sit on the back porch with a beer in hand, Shadow at his feet. Sometimes Lily would visit, curl up next to him, her fingers trailing along. Shadow's thickening fur. She never asked what really happened, but she knew enough. "You saved each other," she said once, her voice full of quiet certainty. Mason didn't correct her. She was right. They had. One night, as autumn settled over Oak Ridge and the wind carried whispers of oncoming frost, Mason received a call from Dave. "I need you to listen carefully," Dave said. "Someone's digging around old Sentinel files. Not law enforcement, something else." Mason's grip on the phone tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this might not be over." Mason looked down at Shadow, who was already watching him, alert, ears forward, like he knew. Outside, a car passed slowly. Too slow. Mason stood. Shadow rose beside him, ready. They had come too far to be afraid now. "We're not running," Mason said quietly. Shadow's tail gave a single, steady wag, because he understood what every soldier, every survivor knows in their bones. We don't. Leave each other behind. In a forgotten town, on a forgotten road, a forgotten dog found a man just as lost. Together, they remembered how to fight, how to hope, and how to heal. Their story isn't over, because justice rarely comes easy. And the past? Past always finds a way back, but so do we.